On April 15th, 2014, 443 passengers and 33 crewmen went onto the Sewol ferry that was set to sail to Jeju Island at 6:30 p.m. from Incheon Port. 325 of those passengers being high school students from Danwon High School. Due to bad weather and fog, the ship had been halted for its departure but finally left port around 9 p.m., filled with excited students on their way to the island for a school trip. In the night, some of the students went to the deck of the ferry to enjoy fireworks, while others stayed in the rooms to play games, sing karaoke, or just to relax. When the passengers woke up the morning of April 16th, the ship was at a slight tilt, but nothing seemed off to the students and other passengers as they sat in the cafeteria enjoying breakfast. Meanwhile, the ship took a sharp turn and it started tilting more towards the sea. Over the intercom, announcement was made that people should stay calm and not move. This announcement kept playing even as the water started pouring into the passenger compartments. You would think that someone from the crew would have helped. However, the first person to make the emergency call was Choi Duk-ha, a student from the ferry at 8:52 a.m. The Coast Guard ordered one boat, the patrol vessel 123, to head to the scene and survey what was happening, as well as start helping the passengers. Just a few minutes later, after Duk-ha's phone call, a crew on the Sewol ferry made a distress call to Jeju's Vessel Traffic Service, or the VTS, and asked them to notify the Korean Coast Guard of the situation. Finally, at 9:07, the crew confirmed that the ferry was capsizing and that they needed help from the Korean Coast Guard. At 9:25, the captain, Lee Jun-suk, was asked to make a decision if people should evacuate the ship, as the VTS did not have enough information about the situation to make the call themselves. The captain, Jun-suk, told the passengers to stay still and not move. However, just a few minutes later, he made the order to evacuate the ferry, but that order was not spread to all the passengers. At 9:38 a.m., all the communication between the VTS and Sewol had been cut off, and just after that, passengers and crew jumped ship. It only took the Sewol about 2.5 hours to be almost completely submerged under the sea. News made the announcement that most of the passengers and crew had all made it safely off board and were being rescued from the water. However, it was quickly discovered that a lot of people from the ferry were missing and that not everyone had made it out. So what really happened that morning on April 16th, 2014? To tell the story, we have to go back, not just to the day before it happened or the day that it happened, but all the way back to when the ship was made, and work out the timeline to figure out why the Sewol sank, why people were told to stay, why so many people were missing, and who is to blame. The Sewol ferry was built in Japan back in 1994. With a length of 146 meters, or 479 feet, and 22 meters, or 72 feet in width, she could carry up to 921 passengers plus crew. She had the legal capacity of 180 vehicles, as well as 154 cargo containers, and her maximum speed was 22 knots, or 41 kilometers per hour, or 22 miles per hour. The ferry had the name Ferry Namino, while she operated in Japan from 1994 to 2012. Then in 2012, she was bought for $11.3 million by Chonghaejin Marine Company in Korea and was renamed to her better-known name as Sewol. After being bought, modifications were made by adding extra cabins for passengers and thereby raising the capacity from just over 800 to the previously mentioned 921 passengers. Then, after the modifications, the Sewol ferry passed safety checks by the Korean Register of Shipping in 2013 and began sailing. The ferry would make 3 round trips a week from Incheon to Jeju. Then, in February of 2014, the Sewol ferry once again had a vessel safety inspection and passed. Although the Sewol ferry passed the safety inspection twice within a year, there was actually a lot of issues with the ship that led to its eventual sinking. The modifications made for the extra cabins had been done illegally, and those redesigns had also removed the center point of gravity off the ferry slightly, and given the ferry a left-right imbalance. After the modifications, the ship had to change their maximum cargo from 1,450 tons to 987 tons, and the ballast amount was increased from 1,333 tons to 1,703 tons. Ballast is a material that gives stability not in just ships but other vehicles as well. Ships have a ballast tank that balances the ship by moving water in and out of the tank.
Whenever a ship makes a hard turn, she should come back to the upright position with no problem at all if she has positive stability.
After the inspections of the ship, there was also added marble to one of the rooms in the ferry, adding another 37 tons to its weight. Neither the Korea Shipping Association or the Korean Coast Guard knew about the Sewol's cargo limits. It was later found out that the ferry had passed their inspections due to falsified documents. The Sewol was scheduled to leave port at 6:30 p.m. However, a fog that was so dense that it restricted sight to less than a kilometer had come in. The Incheon Vessel Traffic Service issued a low visibility warning around 5:30 p.m., so the departure had been postponed. However, after some wait, the Shipping Association cleared the Sewol for departure around 9 p.m., while other ships decided to stay in port due to the fog. As the Sewol left, she was not only carrying her 443 passengers and 33 crew, but also 2,147 tons of cargo, more than double her allowed limit. The cargo, items like shipping containers, trailers, forklifts, and cars, were also not secured properly. It only took the ferry 3 minutes to leave the port after the last person boarded, showing that the crew had not spent a lot of time fastening the cargo properly. The ferry was also only carrying around 721.2 tons of ballast, which was supposed to be around 1,700 tons, and the ballast tanks were not maintained properly either. The captain of the ship, Lee Jun-suk, was a replacement for the regular captain, only known as Captain Shinmo or Captain Shin. Jun-suk had over 40 years of experience and he had traveled that route before. Along with the captain, there were 33 crewmen, however, 19 of them were only part-time workers for the ferry. It was later discovered that the regular captain, Shin, had warned the company about the Sewol's instability, and he had also mentioned that to the authorities of the Incheon port on April 9th of 2014. However, both times, Chung Hae-jin, the company that owns the ship, had apparently threatened the captain on both occasions to stop talking or he would lose his job. Shin had also requested that the steering wheel would be fixed on April 1st of 2014, stating malfunction, however, nothing was ever done. The morning of the accident, at 7:30 a.m., a team switch was performed, and Park Han-kyul, who had only started working for the company less than half a year ago, and Cho Jun-ki took over watch duties. At 8:20 a.m., Park Han-kyul told Yoon-ki to change the steering wheel system from autopilot to manual. While this was going on, the captain was not there by the steering wheel. He was in his cabin resting. What happened next isn't completely clear, as Han-kyul and Yoon-ki had slightly differing stories. However, what the court later determined is that Cho Yoon-ki had turned the wheel to the right, and he had gotten flustered at how fast the ship turned and turned the wheel left. At the same time as he turned the wheel left, Park Han-kyul had made the order to turn the opposite direction, and Yoon-ki thought that meant to put the wheel to the right. However, Park meant the opposite of the side that was leaning heavily towards the water. Due to this, the ship took multiple sharp turns to the right. This is of course a simplified version of events, as I am not a professional in ships, steering them, or any kind of vocabulary that comes to this kind of stuff. The Sewol's sharp turn could not be fixed due to the steering wheel error and because of the overloading of the cargo. The ship then listed 20 degrees into the water at 8:49 a.m., causing the cargo that was not fastened properly to fall to one side of the ship, and some passengers even reported hearing a loud bang somewhere in the ship. As the cargo all fell to one side, the Sewol lost her restoring power to get back up, and water started flowing into the ship through the cargo door on the side, as well as the entrance used for cars. The captain, who had been in his cabin up until this point, rushed to the bridge along with other shipmates and crew. Cho Young-ki then stopped the engine of the ship. It is unknown if he did this because he was told to, or if he did it out of his own volition. As the engine was now off, the Sewol could not change its direction, and just drifted sideways along the water, and then the lights went out as the ferry started listing toward the water. Despite the ferry starting to list and eventually sink, the crew announced through the intercom that the passengers should stay still and not move, as it would be dangerous. This announcement started playing around 8:52 a.m. and would continue to play even though the water was filling up the passenger compartments. Other crew also told passengers to stay, and so did the captain of the Sewol. The first emergency call was made by a 17-year-old Danwon High School student Choi Duk-ha at 8:52 a.m. He got in contact with Mokpo Coast Guard 2 minutes later, and he was asked to give location of the ferry.
우상실입니다. 살리는데요. 배가 침몰되는 것 같아요. 배가 침몰해요? 여기 제주도 가고 있었는데. 예. 여기 지금 배가 떠내려서 떨어진 것 같아요. 지금. 잠깐만요. 자, 지금 타고 계신 배가 침몰한다는 소리예요? 아니면 옆에 있는 다른 배가 침몰한다는 소리예요? 배가 침몰해요.
위치 말해주세요. 위치 배가 어디 있습니까?
위치를 잘 모르겠어요. 지금 여기가.
위치를 모른다고요? 거기 뭐 GPS 경위도 안 나오나요? 경도하고 위도? 배 이름이 뭡니까? 배 이름?
태월호요. 태월호.
At 8:53 a.m., at the orders of the Mokpo Coast Guard, a patrol vessel, number 123, headed to the scene with the Captain Kim on the vessel. According to the Coast Guard Search and Rescue Manual, Patrol Vessel 123 was supposed to survey the accident and start rescuing people. However, when arriving at the scene, Kim made no announcement to the Sewol to evacuate, even though the vessel had its own speaker system. The first distress call made by the crew was made at 8:55 a.m. to the Jeju Vessel Traffic Services, who then contacted the Jeju Coast Guards, who then contacted Mokpo Coast Guard, and then learned that one vessel had been dispatched already.
저는 지금 거의 움직임이 못 나가 있습니다. 어떻게 해야 될까요? 지금 바다에 어디라고 모르겠네. 지금 사람들은 아이스크 작게 짓고 대기하라 했는데 사람들도 브릿지에 모여가지고 지금 거동이 움직일 수가 없는 상태입니다.
At 9:14 a.m., the crew stated that the ship was at an angle that made evacuation impossible. At this point, Kim, the captain of the patrol vessel 123, was appointed the commander of the scene. At 9:23 a.m., the VTS ordered that the crew would tell the passengers to put on the life jackets, and the crew replied that the broadcasting system of the Sewol ferry was out of order. The VTS then told them to go to passengers personally to order them to wear life jackets. Just a few minutes later, the VTS asked Captain Lee to decide if the Sewol should be evacuated, as they did not have enough information to make that decision for him.
여기 세월호입니다. 감도 있습니까? 세월호 진동하는 뭐 있겠습니다. 그 인명 탈출시키는 거는 그 선장님께서 직접 판단하셔갖고 지금 판단을 빠르게 하셔갖고 지금 하십시오.
Lee told the passenger to stay put in their cabins. An announcement was played using the intercom of the ship. But at 9:30, Lee changed the announcement and told passengers to evacuate. However, not everyone heard this announcement. VTS then told ships around the Sewol to drop their lifeboats for the passengers. And 3 minutes later, about 120 passengers and crew jumped off the ship. Among the first people to be saved from the Sewol ferry was its own captain, who left the ship at 9:46 a.m., while most of the passengers of the ferry were still inside. As this was going on at the upper deck and outside, and the captain and crew were being rescued, most of the passengers were still sitting in the cabins as the ferry filled with water, not understanding what was going on. After the sinking, video clips from two students, Park Soo-hyun and Kim Dong-hyuk, were released, shedding more light on the situation inside of the Sewol.
현재 보시는 거는
현재 지금은 배가 기울어졌습니다. 전 토할 것 같고요. 이게 뭔 상황인지 모르겠어. 구명조끼 입으라는 거 침몰되고 있다는 소리 아니야?
무섭다 진짜. 나 이거 어떡하냐. 나 무서워. 나 살고 싶어.
현재 자리에서 움직이지 마시고 안전으로 잡고 대기해 주시기 바랍니다.
야 빨리 구하라고! 야 여기 만약에 나 진짜 죽는 거 아니야?
이런 진짜 욕도 나오는데 어른들한테 보여줄 거라 욕도 못하고 진짜 무섭고 난 살고 싶습니다. 내 마지막으로 진짜 나는 진짜 하고 싶은 게 많은데 진짜 나 무서워요 지금. 나 어떡해요? 네, 할머니 아빠 사랑하고 네 누나 참 많이 싸웠는데 참 고맙고 네 형 마지막으로 보고 싶었는데 형 못 보고 가네요. 네 진짜 그리고 또 한결이 형 군대 갔는데 왜 이렇게 이런 상황만 겹치니.
엄마 사랑해요. 아빠 사랑해요. 둘 다 사랑해요.
우리 김영일 씨 아들이 고맙니다. 이번 일로 죽을 수 있을 것 같으니. 야 계단에 있는 얘들이 제일 무서워. 엄마 아빠 사랑해요 영원아.
좋습니다. 네 살아서 봅시다.
위치에서 움직이지 마시고 주변에 잡을 수 있는 봉이나 잡고 대기해 주시기 바랍니다.
야 미쳤나봐.
이런 상황에서 막 그러지 않냐? 안전하니까 가만히 있으라고.
그런 거 주는 거야.
드레기 나오고 영어 왜다 그러잖아. 그 지하철도 그렇잖아. 안전하니까 좀만 있어달라고 했는데 진짜 좀 무서운데.
우리 진짜로 이만큼 귀여운 거야. 진짜야
나간
이거.
사람들은 살고 이만저렇게 미리.
In the clips, you can hear announcements being played multiple times, telling people and sometimes even specifically the students to stay still. Most of the passengers obeyed this announcement, and most of the people that did disobey the orders made it out alive. The teachers were helping students, calling their families, and giving life vests to other students. A 6-year-old boy, Kwon Hyuk-gyu, helped his little sister by giving his own life vest. Students were sending their families texts, videos, and calling them as the Sewol sank with them still inside.
10-6 걱정하지 말아요. 살아서 갈게요. 이게 마지막이고요. 이게 10시 7분이에요. 10시 7분. 10시 7분. 이때까지 살아가지고.
The last text message to be sent from the sinking boat was at 10:17 a.m. The first boat to arrive at the scene was the patrol vessel 123, which arrived at 9:30 a.m. However, as mentioned before, the captain of the vessel did not do anything to help the people out of the ship. Almost 10 minutes later, a rubber boat was sent to the ferry to start getting survivors, and the first of those being the Sewol's own captain and crew. By this time, the ship was listing so badly that people couldn't get into the ferry to help people. Some passengers got trapped inside the pilot house, so they were rescued by breaking the glass and pulled out. There were multiple reasons why people arrived to the scene so late. Of course, one of them being the late reaction time of the crew and his captain. On top of that, the crew sent a signal to Jeju rather than Jindo, which was a lot closer.
Who they were speaking to, they made contact with the traffic control at its destination rather than the traffic control where it began, which they were much closer to. Does that pose a problem?
Absolutely. They should have been talking to Jintu traffic control. That was the area they were in. If you can picture an airplane, it'd be like an airplane flying around Boston. Rather than talking to Boston Air Traffic Control, they would be talking to, say, LaGuardia.
The Jindo Coast Guard had no clue what was going on, not only because they didn't get a distress call, but also because of their own negligence. The Sewol ferry had entered the Jindo's jurisdiction around 7 a.m. At the Jindo's Coast Guard station, there were supposed to be 2 officers, how only one was on duty, and they were not checking the monitors. Because if he had done that, they would have noticed that the Sewol ferry was in trouble. So when the Sewol ferry sent their first signal to Jeju, Jindo didn't have their eyes on the monitor. It took 12 minutes for the Sewol to get in contact with Jindo, 12 precious minutes that could have been used to send someone from Jindo. It wasn't until 9:40 a.m. that the Ministry of Oceans and Fishery declared that the sinking was of the highest state of emergency. Government agencies were more interested in sending cameras over to the accident rather than push the rescue. A chopper and a patrol vessel had not given any instruction to the passengers on what to do, and instead filmed the people that sat on top of the ferry.
그렇게 대기하다가 헬기 소리 들려서 내다봤는데 헬기 역시 방송을 전혀 안 했었어요. 123 정도 마찬가지고 카메라만 앞에 나와 있고, 근데 단 한 번도 그 구조 요원이 뭐 어떻게 해야 된다라는 어떤 그 지시 아닌 지시 같은 도움을 주는 발언을 한 적도 없고.
예, 그 지금 2785가 지금 영상이 안 나오는데 예? 다른 데 좀 연결해 주세요. ENG 카메라.
아, 지금 저희들도 지금 잘 안 되고 있거든요.
아, 그래요?
예.
되는 거 하나 없어요? 한 대도 없어요?
예, 지금 현재 저희들도 그래서 현재가 지금 못 보고 있습니다. 어차피 지금 그 2788도 거기 현재가 지금 못 갔어요, 아직.
그래요?
예.
그 다음에 가까운 건 없어요? 278 말고.
예, 지금 현장에서 이제 군리작업 중이라서 정신이 없거든요, 지금.
아, 그래요?
예.
상황이 들어오신다 해가지고.
예, 상업장입니다.
예, 청와대인데요.
예, 안녕하십니까.
그 영상 가지고 있는 해경 도착했어요?
아직 도착 못했습니다.
얼마 남았어?
지금
그 배가 빨리 가야 되는데.
Passengers tried to help each other out from the ferry as it filled with water, and inside the ferry you could see people banging the windows but failing to break the glass.
크레인 기사분들 같이 객실 사용하셨던 분들이랑 탈출을 돕기 시작을 했죠. 탈출을 위해서 이렇게 밧줄 계속 잡아당겨주고 있는데 갑자기 물이 막 차올라오는 거예요. 멍하니 앞에 있다가 무릎 꿇고 있었어요. 빨리 잡아서 끌어내야 되니까 앞에서 물 차오르게 기다렸죠. 그렇게 손이 닿는 대로 막 끌어당기다가 작은 체구의 아이를 안게 됐고, 그 아이를 안는 순간 물살에 밀려가지고 나오게 됐고요. 정말 힘든 탈출이었죠. 아무도 도와주지 않는. 그곳에 우리를 지키는 누군가는 없었어요. 정말 단 한 명도.
우선 저희는 구조를 당한 게 아니라 저희는 저희 스스로 탈출한 거고, 신호를 보냈는데도 구조하지 않고, 또 선장은 그렇게 자기 혼자만 나와버리고 너무 화가 나고 이해도 안 가고.
At 10:20 a.m., Patrol Vessel 123 was still the only Coast Guard boat out there, while there were several other fishermen boats that helped save passengers. At that time, the boat was almost completely in the water. In the video of the sinking, you can see that most of the lifeboats were still on Sewol, so there was limited space on the boats that were helping. Just a few minutes later, a call between the Coast Guard and the President's office took place.
첫째, 단 한 명도 인명피해 발생하지 않도록 하라. 그 다음에 여객선 내에 객실, 엔진실 등을 포함해서 철저히 확인해가지고 누락되는 인원이 없도록 하라. 자, 그 두 가지 말씀하셨으니까 일단 그 청장님한테 메모를 빨리 넣어드리고.
지금 현장에 그 헬기에서 구조사가 한두 명 구조하는 게 문제가 아니고 제 생각입니다만은 일단 그 여객선에 내려서 여객선이 지금 얼마만큼 기울어졌고 일단은 무조건 물에 뛰내리는 게 낫겠다든지 아니면 나올 때 순서대로 나오되 이렇게 지휘할 사람이 필요하거든요. 현장에서 문을 내가 안에 있는 사람이 갑판으로 일단 나오게 물에 뛰내도록 해야 된단 말입니다. 그 문제 내리가 그 위험 속에서 구조한 놈은 나중에 정말 공을 세울 수 있는 거 아니에요.
예, 지금 여객선에 우리 항공 구조단이 못 내려갑니까?
아직 못 내리고 앞에 선수만 남아 있다던데 지금은 내리지 못할 것 같습니다.
그러니까 진작 좀 내렸다고 그림이 됐어야 되는데 지금 그게 문제란 말이에요. 못 올라가면은 우리가 올라가고 유도한 게 보여줬어야 되는데.
This call clearly showed that they had no clue what was going on. The Coast Guard later says to the Air Rescue Service that it would have been good to have the helicopter land on the ferry to make a good scene. In this call, the air rescue says that the passengers escaped the ferry and that most had made it out, which was a complete lie.
승객들은 거의 다 나왔어요, 배에서?
예.
그러면 대부분 다 나왔다는 얘기예요? 선장에는 없다는 이야기예요?
예, 그 전부터 계속 비 울리면서부터 사람이 나와 있었기 때문에
예.
내부 수색은 정확하게 안 했는데
예.
거의 다 나간 걸로 지금 확인이 되는.
그러면은 선내에 일단 사람들이 거의 없는 걸로 봐야 되네요.
예, 예.
In reality, out of the 476 people on board, only 172 made it out. Out of the 304 people that were still trapped inside the ferry when it sank, 250 of them were high school students. At 11 a.m., NBC started reporting that all of the students had been saved from the ferry, and after that, other media outlets started reporting that too, and it kept being reported for the next 30 minutes. At the same time, a text message was also sent out to all the high school students' parents saying that they had made it out. The first reports of the sinking stated that most of the people had jumped out when the Sewol started first sinking, and that 368 people had been saved from the water. However, at 1 p.m., it was reported that 107 passengers were missing, and then later on it was reported that 295 passengers were missing.
뭐 생각할 겨를도 없었고 그냥 거기서 다 같이 어떤 주민분 집에 들어가가지고 그냥 계속 뉴스 보고 있고 전원 구조라고 뜬 거예요. 근데 순간 저희도 다행이다 이 생각을 했는데 진도체육관으로 갈 때 또 배를 타고 가긴 했거든요. 근데 거기서 TV를 봤을 때 점점 이렇게 실종자 수가 너무 많이 느는 거예요. 그래서 그때 좀 너무 이상하다 이런 생각 들었던 것 같아요.
More misinformation was being spread as well. As I mentioned before, the last text message to be sent from the ferry was sent at 10:17 a.m. on April 16th. However, text and social media posts started circulating, saying stuff like, "I'm alive in the cafeteria. Please help me, my battery is running out. Please believe me." And, "My phone is not working. I'm inside the boat. I can't see anything." These types of messages were being posted even 24 hours after the accident. Many people were hoping that there were air pockets in the ship, and these texts gave people hope that the survivors were still trapped in the ship. However, the police cyber terror response center later came out saying that all those texts that came out were faked. Sadly, the news media also reported on this information and had to backtrack once again. The media would also intrude as the victims came to shore, went to the hospital, and anywhere else they could. They would take photos of them without asking, trying to ask them questions. They did the same to the families and friends of those who waited by the docks for news.
As if the tragedy itself was not overwhelming enough, Ejin was bombarded with reporters and camera flashes.
그때도 너무 정신없었고 솔직히 무례하다고 생각 들었어요. 너무. 그때 우리가 아직 학생이고 아직 미성년자인데 그런 참사를 겪고 나왔는데 막 다 카메라 셔터 막 하고 버스에서 내려서 체육관 들어가려는데 그때 엄마 아빠가 저를 보고 앉는데 그 장면을 너무 찍는 거예요. 근데 당연히 기자들은 그런 거를 찍어야 사람들이 많이 보고 그런 건 알지만 그래서 저희는 엄마랑 이렇게 안을 겨를도 없이 진도체육관 안으로 들어갔었거든요. 네, 그리고 또 애들이 그렇게 울고 있는데 굳이 앞에서 사진을 찍고 또 인터뷰를 계속 하려는 거예요. 애들 안 그래도 추스리고 있는데.
Some reporters even stooped so low to break into Dangwon High School to look for victims' belongings so they could write a story about the kids who died or went missing in the accident. On top of that, for the first 7 hours of the sinking, the president of South Korea, Park Geun-hye, was nowhere to be found. When she finally popped up, she seemed to have a limited understanding on how serious the situation really was. Prosecutors charged the captain with homicide and wanted to go for the death penalty. The lead prosecutors in the case, Park Jae-ok, said, quote, "Lee supplied the cause of the sinking of the Sewol. He has the heaviest responsibility for the accident. We ask that the court sentence him to death." End quote. Months later after the accident, in November, Lee was found guilty of negligence and got charged with 36 years in jail, escaping the death penalty. The judges said that he was not the only person responsible for the tragedy, and his negligence did not mean that he had the intent to kill, and there wasn't enough evidence for that. so that he could not be charged with murder. The chief engineer, Park Gi-ho, was found guilty of murder as he had not helped 2 crew members who died in the sinking. He was sentenced to 30 years in jail. The other 13 crew members received sentences from 5 to 20 years for charges like abandonment, violating maritime law, and more. Kim Han-sik, the CEO of Chung Hae-jin, was found guilty of negligence, receiving 10 years in prison. 4 other officials from Chung Hae-jin were also found guilty on similar charges, receiving from 3 years to 6 years in prison. 2 other employees of Chung Hae-jin received suspended prison sentences. An official from the Korean Shipping Association, who was in charge of overseas safety issues in ships, was sentenced to 3 years as he had let the ferry leave port without checking its cargo and storage. And 2 employees of a private company that loaded up the cargo received 2-year prison terms. The public was not happy with the sentencing, saying that the captain deserved the death penalty. There were appeals filed both by the prosecutors and the accused, and in April of 2015, the captain was found guilty of murder, and his sentence was increased to life in prison. The judge said, quote, Lee was only interested in saving himself instead of looking after the passengers on board, whose safety solely depended upon the captain's instruction in such an emergency. End quote. The court also dismissed the crew's testimony that said that they had heard the captain order an evacuation, saying, quote, their testimonies lack credibility and thus had no impact on acquitting Lee of the charges. It is highly likely that they lied to avoid incrimination themselves. The court deems the testimony of the lowest-ranking crew members truthful for admitting that there was no instruction whatsoever, unquote. Other crew's sentences were lowered to between 18 months to 12 years, and the chief engineer's sentence was reduced from 30 years to 10 years. Regarding this, the judge said, quote, we drew a distinction between the Captain Lee Jun-suk, who has a grave responsibility, and the crew who took orders from the captain, end quote. The CEO of Chung Hae-jin also received a reduced sentence from 10 years to 7 years, as his actions were directed by Yoo Byung-eun, the owner of Chung Hae-jin. Speaking of Yoo Byung-eun, he is one shady man, and I'm not going to get into it here. I will say this. He is linked in some way to the Dae-yang mass suicide. After the sinking, he was not seen in public, and he was banned from leaving the country. During the investigation, Han-sik said that he had notified Byung-eun of overloading the ferry earlier that same year. On May 22, 2014, the Incheon District Court issued an arrest warrant for Yoo. Following that, Yoo Byung-eun went into hiding to avoid the arrest, and he became South Korea's most wanted fugitive. On June 30th, the prosecution announced that they were going to indict Byung-eun regardless if he was caught or not, mentioning charges of homicide by negligence. 2 days after his arrest warrant was made, people who were warned about whoever helped him would face prison sentences. On May 25th, 4 people were arrested for helping Byung-eun escape the police, and later 2 more people were arrested for helping him evade detection of the police for weeks. The South Korean authorities offered 50 million won in rewards for any information that led to his arrest, and then later the award was raised to 500 million won. On June 12th, a body was found in a plum field just out of the city Suncheon. It was then confirmed that the body belonged to Yoo Byung-eun.
In an extraordinary twist of events, in the early hours of the morning on the 23rd of July, as the manhunt continued, authorities announced Yoo Byung-eun was dead.
Yoo's badly decomposed body was found in scrubland in the southern part of the country. Police could not say when or how Yoo died, but they're sure the remains are his.
His body had been found in a plum orchard more than a month earlier, but was so badly decomposed it had only just been identified.
Lastly, after the president's lackluster response to the sinking, the public were very upset, angry, and wanted her gone from office. After digging, more and more corruption in connection to Park Geun-hye started coming to light. It became a whole issue, now known as the 2016 South Korean political scandal. It is way too big to get into here now, so I highly recommend doing your own research. Following the scandal, Park Geun-hye was arrested on March 31st, 2017, and then in April that same year, she was charged with abuse of power, bribery, coercion, and leaking government secrets. She denied these charges multiple times. On April 6, 2018, she was found guilty of 16 of the 18 charges that she had on her back. She was sentenced to 24 years in prison and had to pay a fine of 18 billion won. Although her sentencing was not just related to the Sewol sinking, this started all with that moment. After the sinking, divers began looking throughout the sunken ferry in hopes of finding some survivors in air pockets. After the sinking, air was pumped into the ferry to support possible air pockets. However, instead, that made the rest of the ferry sink.
에어포켓이라도 존재한다고 하면 거기 있으면 살 확률이 있으니까요. 18일 새벽에 이제 들어가려고 했는데 그 해경에서 VIP가 와서 지켜보고 있으니까 에어 주입을 꼭 해야 된다. 이걸 갖고 물에 들어가면 애들을 살리려고 하는 게 아니라 니들이 죽겠다. VIP가 보고 있으니까 어떻게든 흉내라도 내야 된다. VIP가 와서 지켜보고 있으니까 에어 주입 성공했다는 또 얘기를 해야 될 거 아니에요. 그러니까 그 쇼를 또 하더라고. 주입하는 도중에 벌써 제가 점점 가라앉기 시작하는 거예요. 오전도 안 돼서 가면 완전 침몰됐을걸요.
나는 대한민국에서 살면서 열심히 살아서 세금 잘 내고 내 자식 잘 키우는 것밖에 없어. 근데 당신들이 왜 그래? 구해준다 그랬잖아. 그런데 왜 바다에다가 풍덩 더 가라앉혔어? 대통령이 왔는데 해결을 이것밖에 못 해줘? 그 순간은 이게 확 뒤집어졌던 것 같아요. 이건 아니다.
Bodies of students and other passengers were recovered, sometimes tens of passengers found together in one room. Choi Duk-ha, the student who made the call before anyone else on the ferry of the morning of the sinking, sadly was one of those who did not make it out and was recovered.
Parents rushed to the white tents to identify their children. You must have said, "Daddy, save me," weeps this father. No one is immune to the sound of losing a child.
A lot of civilian divers helped in the search up until July 10th when the government ordered the civilian divers to stop the search and leave the area.
(4월 17일) 날 가서 7월 10일까지 있으면서 제가 한 25곳에서 30곳 정도를 수습을 했는데
3 years after the sinking, the Sewol was finally erased from the ocean. 9 passengers were still missing, and some parts of the ferry had not been searched so far, so this gave people hope that the 9 lost passengers could be found. After the ferry finally made it to land, 4 more people were found. 299 passengers were recovered and returned to their families. However, till this day, 5 passengers have not been found and are lost at sea. One of those missing passengers being the 6-year-old Kwon Hyuk-kyu, the boy who had given his sister his life vest that morning of the sinking. His father, Kwok Jae-gun, was also never found. Due to Kyok-yu's bravery, his 5-year-old sister, Ji-yeon, made it out alive, her being the only family member to do so. The other 3 lost at sea are 2 students, Park Jo-in and Nam Hyo-chol, and 1 teacher, Yang Sung-jin. Along with the 304 souls lost in the Sewol ferry sinking, 9 other people in connection to the ferry passed away. 2 days after being saved from the ferry, Kang Min-kyu, the vice principal of Danwon High School, took his own life. In the note he left behind, he said, "Surviving alone is too painful when 200 lives are unaccounted for. I take full responsibility." Min-kyu then asked that he would be cremated and his ashes would be spread over the site where the ferry went down, saying, "I might be a teacher in heaven to those kids whose bodies were never found." On May 6, 2014, a 53-year-old diver who was doing his first dive in search of bodies was pulled out of the water by his fellow divers and had passed away. Another diver, aged 46, was working on cutting a new access hole into the ferry and sadly met some issues and passed away in late May of 2014. In July of 2014, a helicopter carrying emergency workers who were involved with the ferry disaster operations crashed, and 5 people died and 1 got injured in the accident. And lastly, Kim Kwan-hong, also a diver, has suffered injuries while helping the search and rescue, making him unable to work as a diver. In 2015, he testified in the government hearing that he had suffered painful memories that haunted him. Kwan Hong passed away in June of 2016 from suicide.
고위 공무원들한테 묻겠습니다. 저희는 그 당시에 생각이 다 나요. 잊을 수 없고 뼈에 사무치는데 사회 지도층이신 고위 공무원께서는 왜 모르고 왜 기억이 안 나는지.
배는 바지는 가만히 있고 잠수들만 나올 때 비바람 치고 파도 치고 이러는데 작은 새들이 날아와요. 작은 새들이 그 추위에 강풍에 비바람에 작아요. 새가 아주 되게 이뻐요. 그 새 소리도 이뻐요. 그 비 소리에 저들이 울부짖는 게 자기네들을 두고 떠나지 말라고 울부짖는 겁니다.
Many memorials, vigils, protests, and events were held to remember the people who lost their lives. In November of 2017, a funeral for the 5 missing passengers were held. Their coffins were filled with stuff that was salvaged from the ships, clothes, and other belongings. An honorary graduation ceremony was held for the high school victims on February 12, 2019. The graduation had originally been planned to take place in 2016, the same year the students should have graduated if they had not tragically lost their lives, but had been postponed as 2 students had not been found. A yellow ribbon has become the symbol to remember those who lost their lives in the Sewol sinking, and every year people will post yellow ribbons and commemorate them on social media to remind people to never forget. The yellow ribbon is a symbol of hope of return, mourning to activism and democratization. Although it's been 7 years, the people we lost will never be replaced. People still have questions and built up anger. Family members of those who lost someone will never get them back, and even some of them tried to take their own lives to be with their lost loved ones.
그 시간이 보니까는 선장에 나오던 시간이더라고요. 9시 47분인가 제가 통화를 했어요. 딱 그때 이제 선장이 근데 보니까 딱 구출되는 시간이고, 그때도 제가 이제 저기 하니까 선생님 말씀 잘 듣고, 근데 그게 제일 후회스럽더라고요. 그러니까 애를 빨리 나오라고 그랬는데 제 배의 상황을 몰라갖고 무조건 선생님 말씀 잘 듣고 있으라고, 선생님 하라는 대로 잘하라고, 알았다고 저기 하라고. 근데 그게 이제는 그 뒤에 전화를 하니까 안 되더라고요, 전화가.
7월 10일 날 나오고 한 1년 반 그 정도까지 잠을 잘 못 잤어요. 어떻게 보면 저한테도 아픔이에요. 저한테도 큰 마음속에 이제 짐이고.
나오라고 말 한마디만 했었으면 다 나았을 텐데.
보면 우는데 못 버려요, 집사람.
지금 이제 보충 수업 끝나고 들어올 것 같아서 그냥 올 것 같아요. 인정하고 싶지가 않은 거예요, 얘가. 죽었다는 거를 인정하고 싶지가 않은 거예요. 그래서 언젠가는 오겠지.
The ones who survived had to tolerate not only immense trauma and loss themselves, but also harassment by the media. Some struggles with survival guilt, depression, anxiety, and other mental illnesses, as this is something they can never forget.
우리는 너희들을 절대 잊지 않고 기억하고 있을게. 우리가 나중에 너희들을 만나는 날이 올 때 우리들을 잊지 말고 18살 그 시절 모습을 기억해 줬으면 좋겠어.
As I said earlier, today marks the 7-year anniversary of the Sewol Ferry sinking, but we can never forget the lives lost in the tragic accident. Remember them.
그리운 이들의 이름을 하나씩 아껴 불러봅니다. 잊지 않겠습니다. 1번
고혜인, 김민지, 김민희, 김수경, 김수진, 김영경, 김예은, 김주아, 김현정, 문지성, 박성빈, 우소영, 유미지, 이수연, 이연화, 정가현, 조 김유정 김주희 김지윤 남수빈 남지현 박정은 박주희 박혜선 송진아 양온유 오유정 윤민지 윤솔 이혜경 전하영 정지야 조서우 한세영 허다윤 허유림 김담비 김도원 김빛나라 김소연 김수경 김시연 김영은 김주은 김지인 박영란 박예슬 박지우 박지윤 박채연 백지숙 신승희 유예은 유혜원 이지민 장주희 전영수 정예진 최수희 최윤민 한은지 황지현
4번
강승묵 강신욱 강혁 권오천 김건우 김대희 김동혁 김범수 김용진 김웅기 김윤수 김정현 김호연 박수현 박정훈 빈하용 슬라바 안준혁 안영준 임경빈 임요한 장진용 정차웅 정휘범 진우혁 최성호 한정무 홍순영
오번.
김건우 김건우 김도현 김민석 김민성 김성현 김완준 김인호 김진광 김한별 문중식 박성호 박준민 박진리 박홍래 서동진 오준영 이석준 이진환 이창현 이홍승 인태범 정이삭 조성원 전인호 최남혁 최민석
6번
구태민 권순범 김동영 김동협 김민규 김승태 김승혁 김승환 남현철 박세도 박영인 서재능 선우진 신호성 이건계 이다운 임세희 정다빈 정다혜 조은정 진윤희 최진아 변다인 강한솔 구보현 권지혜 김다영 김민정 김송희 김슬기 김유민 김주희 박정슬 이가영 이경민 이경주 이다혜 이단비 이소진 이은별 이혜주 장수정 장혜원
선생님들.
강민규 고창석 김응현 김초원 남윤철 葛육근 양승진 윤이나 이지혜 이혜봉 정수영 최혜정 권재근 권혁규 김순금 김연혁 리샹하오 문인자 박성미 백평권 서규석 서순자 신경순 심숙자 우정달 윤춘연 이광진 이도남 이세영 이영숙 이은창 이재창 인옥자 전종현 정명숙 정원재 정중훈 조지훈 조충환 지혜진 최순복 최승호 최창복 한금희 현윤지 김문희 박지영 안현영 양대홍 이묘희 정현선
아르바이트 분들.
춘